Does it say whether or not we have participants yet, or like that people waiting to get in?
Nope, not yet. It's
Okay.
just you guys.
Okay. It won't show up on that. It might show up on the YouTube.
The participant log.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay.
All right. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. We will get started in about 2 minutes. Just let a few more people trickle in. So. Is that the fan?
I think so. So as I receive questions here, if you just want to wait to the end to...
If they seem off, if they seem like they're a little delayed, if they comes in right away, then we could do them. But just thinking about the lag, that I'm thinking maybe we're not going to get them right on time. That we could try and.
Okay.
If you get it right away, then feel free to do them too.
Okay. Do you want me to say them to you, or do you want me to just text you?
You can say it to me.
Okay.
Or you can text me too if that works better. We'll wait another one.
Text you so like I don't interrupt you with like your train of thought.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
You're up to 66.
All right.
How long are this one?
30 something. So we'll give it another minute and then we'll just get going.
Okay.
All right. We might as well get started. Tim, are you ready if we get started right now?
I am.
Perfect. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a continuation in our forensic CLEs. I'm Alicia Lilly. Joining me today, as always, is Tim Crino, our forensic consultant. And we're here today to talk about an introduction to blood spatter and a continuation of all of the CLEs we've been doing with respect to crime scene investigation. And this is just building off of our last CLE on body fluid. So today we want to make sure that we thank ILS, who makes this CLE possible, and the forensic unit. They work tirelessly to provide legal services to the indigent. So we are very thankful to ILS for making this possible. And obviously, though, that goes without saying that the views expressed today are those of the assigned counsel program, not any state or federal agency. So with that, I will turn it over to Tim to get us started.
So our goal today will be just to learn how blood spatter interpretation can be used to assist in explaining some of the physical events which took place at a bloody crime scene. You know, this is a very, very introductory course. We only have an hour together today. This is quite an involved subject matter. I have here like a booklet of someone that recently attended training that was actually offered at Hilbert College, and that was a basic bloodstain pattern analysis course, which was a week long. So we are barely scratching the surface here today, but we wanted to give you a little bit of a background and understanding in blood spatter, especially for those of you who have not had a lot of experience with this topic. Our objectives will be basic ones, to explain documentation that should have taken place at the crime scene. You know, I'm always hammering that home, that our 12-step process, and one of those is proper documentation. Understanding the factors which can help reconstruct the scene. And if you leave here today knowing the 3 classifications of impact spatter, you'll be well on your way for understanding this topic a little bit better. So what is blood spatter? And you'll see in this presentation today, we will constantly be referring to it as spatter as opposed to splatter, okay? Spatter and splatter can be used interchangeably. They both have to do with a liquid. Splatter is typically when you're talking about the splashing of a larger amount of liquid, whereas spatter is a smaller amount of liquid. For purposes of today, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a future slide, we are going to be using the word and referring to it as spatter. So bloodstain pattern analysis is the examination of the shapes, locations, and distribution patterns of bloodstains in order to provide an interpretation. You'll see I have that different color and underline because it is an interpretation of the physical events which gave rise to their origin. This is all based on a premise, that blood stains and blood stain patterns are characteristic of the forces that have created them. And again, those forces that have created them will be referred to today for the most part as different types of impact.
In this blood stain pattern analysis, this has been found to be an accepted practice from the courts. They did not requiring a Fry hearing. So they've said, this is an analysis. It does not involve novel scientific techniques. So there's no issue as to the validity of what the experts have been doing. So if people are looking to introduce expert testimony, the courts are typically not going to, or are not going to request a Fry hearing. Most of the departments, or all of the departments, have really weighed off on it. The 4th department saying such evidence has long been deemed reliable. So it's coming in.
So our next slide. So why do we analyze blood spatter? The determinations made from bloodstain patterns at the scene or from clothing of principals in the case can be used to, number 1, confirm or refute assumptions concerning events and their sequence, such as position of victims, were they standing, were they sitting, were they lying down, evidence of a struggle, Some evidence of that could be blood smears, blood trails, other obvious blood type patterns, which we will discuss as this next hour goes on. Number two, it'll confirm or refute statements made by principals in the case. Are the stain patterns on a subject's clothing consistent with his or her reported actions? Are the stain patterns on a victim or at a crime scene consistent with accounts given by witnesses and or the suspect of the case?
And this is something that's, more easily tested because blood is predictable and these things can be repeatable. Obviously, there's external factors that can impact, how much force something is going or how fast something dries. But, the blood itself, it's not impacted by toxicity. Somebody intoxicated by drugs or alcohol, the behavior of the blood is going to be the same. And I'm going to
Right.
speak louder, so I apologize.
With certain outside forces having some effect on it, such as wind, heat, humidity, distance of travel, terminal velocity, things of that nature. But the blood is still consistent within those variables also, and those can be accounted for and gauged. So unfortunately today we are meeting virtually. It's so much more one-dimensional doing it this way. I've given this presentation in the past and I've given it in person, and it's so much more dynamic when there's certain things that I can show and do and throw fake blood around and show you differences in impact of blood or liquid surfaces. And unfortunately today we can't do that. So possibly at some future time, some future date, that will be possible again. So terminology for blood stain pattern analysis. There is a working group that has established recommended terminology along with definitions to help standardize this field of investigation. And some of the terms are ones such as blood stain, swipe, wipe, spatter, drip stain, going on and on. Alicia, I think you were going to give a definition for some of the first few here.
Yep. And just so you know, this, like, going and looking up this working group, it is a really great resource. It's like this 5-page almost dictionary as to the terms that are accepted within this forensic practice. So obviously with any forensic practice, you do better to familiarize yourself with it, if not only just to not look like an idiot, but to be able to have actual conversations with, in front of the judge, with the defense or with the prosecutor, with your expert, and understanding what your expert is telling you when they're analyzing the scene for you. So it's a good thing to be able to understand what they're saying. So they give the specific definition of blood stain, which is a deposit of blood on a surface. Like, understanding when they're talking about blood stain, we're talking about that deposit of blood on some sort of surface. The spatter being the blood stain that is being dispersed through the air by an external force, and then that landing somewhere. That is the spatter stain. And noting on there on the slide, splatter, as Tim mentioned earlier, it has no technical meaning in this forensic practice. So when you walk around talking about blood splatter on a case, and you're talking to people who practice forensics, they know that you're not as well versed. A swipe pattern is a blood stain that results from a transfer of blood from the blood-bearing surface onto another surface. So if there is a pool of blood, a blood stain here on this podium, and I, swipe my arm against it, and I end up with blood on my sweater here, that's a swipe pattern that you would see. versus a white pattern. So if I have the same pool of blood, the same blood stain on this podium, and I take this pen and I let the pen roll down through the blood stain, then that's going to create a wipe pattern. There's also a drip stain. If I have blood on my face, the drip stain is a blood stain that results from gravity. So if I have the blood pooling on my face, it's going to naturally come down and it's going to naturally drip either on the podium or on the floor as a result of gravity. That's known as a drip stain.
And that wipe can also be where, like you wash your hands, and your hands now are wet, and you wipe them off on another surface, like a towel. So if it was blood, that would then create a blood stain pattern from the wipe. So we also have expirated blood. So expire, the Latin for breathing out. So that is caused by coughing and sneezing, or if there's blood in the nose and you exhale deeply through your nose, that airflow from the cough, the sneeze, the blowing out of your nose can and will cause a blood stain pattern. You have your parent stain. That's typically a word given for the main stain that you're looking at that point in time, whether it's a drip with smaller satellite stains around it, or it's the main pool, for lack of a better term, of blood that you're dealing with. And of course, the satellite stain, as I just mentioned, is a smaller stain that comes off the larger parent stain. And then you have an insect stain. This is something out on the fringes of this, but it does exist and it does need to be explained. That can be in 2 or 3 different ways. One can be, so typically if it's a crime scene that's been there for a while, or blood that's collected and it's been there for a while, typically your first insect to arrive on the scene is going to be your fly. You can have instances where a fly or some other flying object or crawling object can actually move through a blood stain and cause its own little tracks or marks or lines as they're traveling through it. That insect stain can also be caused from them being the insect ingesting that blood, and then a short time later either regurgitating that blood or defecating and causing another unique stain. So all things that the trained eye can discern and distinguish in a situation where they're analyzing bloodstain patterns. We'll look at this slide over here to the right, this diagram. We have it here and we have it in a few other places throughout our presentation. It's a great representation of an impact and cast off and other things that happen when something comes in contact with blood. So we'll be referring to this a few times over the next 45 minutes or so. So your documentation. And I keep going back to this. It's a common theme of mine and will forever be a common theme of mine. Where if you've been watching these from the beginning when we started doing these about a year ago, and I think our first presentation was on the 12-step process for crime scene searches and crime scene investigations. And you know how I always harp on, two of the 12 steps are the photography and sketching of a scene. So again, very, very important when you're dealing with a crime scene and blood spatter. So it should be properly photographed and sketched. And again, we've talked about this before. Anytime I've ever talked about photography and a crime scene or a search scene, I've always stated that there should be 3 sets or 4 sets of photos. Your long range photos, which give a perspective, in this case, when we're dealing with stains, of the stains in relation to the whole room or the whole area. Then your medium range photographs, which in the case of blood patterns or blood stains, showing the whole pattern and the relationship between individual stains within the pattern. And then there's the up close photos, which I always speak of. And I always talk about doing up close with and without scale. First without scale, and then adding scale to the photograph so that you can have the exact size of what you're looking at in that photograph. So here's a representative photograph of a scene, and I would I would call this probably the long range photograph. It's probably a smaller room, so because of the difficulty in photographing a small room, this is the longest range that they could probably get on the photo. It's an interesting photo. It shows 2 walls. It shows the headboard. You can almost tell with just being a novice, the direction of the impact, the direction the blood traveled. You can actually see that in this photograph, the photograph has been taken looking down on on the pattern as opposed to a level and looking across it. Because if you look very carefully at the top horizontal post on it, and even the second one, you can actually see voids there where it is void of blood all the way across behind those 2 bars because of the fact that those bars blocked the blood as the spatter was going out and toward and upward on those walls. And then below that, there's 3 different grids, and we're going to be talking about of the grid diagrams with diagramming bloodstain pattern. So you have 3 grids marked 1, 2, and 3, and you'll see that this is a close-up photo with scale, just to show why scale is put in. So scale is important for 2 reasons. And a lot of time for courtroom presentations, you'll have what was at one time a normal size photo, for a lack of a better term, or something that was 4x5 or 8x10. And for courtroom purposes, it's blown up into this huge presentation for court purposes. And it's important to have that scale in there, so because then you can get the relationship between the scale and what the true size, in this case, the stains are. The other important reason for scale is when it's very, very important for an investigator to look at the photograph in a 1-to-1 comparison, where the photograph they're looking at is a depiction of the actual size of what was photographed. So whether or not it was blown up or reduced in the dark room originally, that when they're doing 1-to-1 comparisons, the person processing that and making that representation can get that stain or that latent fingerprint or that tread wear or shoe print impression at an exactly 1-to-1 for comparison purposes. So the only way you could possibly do that is to have scale in there. If the investigator didn't happen to have a small ruler with them that day, you could actually throw a dollar bill in there or a quarter, something that is representative of something that can be measured and made a certain size, so that when you're recreating that photograph, you can get it exactly 1-to-1.
And here's our first code. Anybody who's just listening and doesn't see it, it is the word stain, STAIN. It's our first code.
I'll leave that up there for a couple more seconds. And moving on. So, methods of documenting blood stains. I just started to speak of that a little bit, and we'll see some examples of that. The grid method is what I was just talking about in that last photograph where we saw in the lower right-hand corner of the screen the 1, 2, and 3. Those were different grid areas. Typically, when you're gridding out a blood stain pattern on a wall, you'll use strings, and by stakes we really don't mean driving stakes into the wall. I mean, you would never want to do that at a crime scene. At the most, you would want to use tacks. Tacks aren't really even something that I would prefer to use. When I was hold up my strings, I would use a sticky substance. It's sort of that substance, say when you get a new credit card in the mail and you have that credit card held to the piece of paper that it comes on in the envelope, that sticky substance that you can peel off of the paper and off of the credit card behind it, and it doesn't damage the card and or the paper, but it's still very, very sticky and pliable. We have that type substance we can use to hold our strings up, or we can use painter's tape, something that wouldn't damage the wall when we were taking the string down. The string, of course, is one and done. You would use it once. You would never want to use it again, of course, for cross-contamination purposes. I would probably even save the string along with the rest of the evidence in case anything from the walls by way of blood or trace will have transferred from the wall onto the string. So I would probably save that. Photographs are first taken of the blood stain pattern and then taken with the grid in place. And then you got the perimeter ruler method. That is a kit that a crime scene investigator can buy. It has a series of rulers that are attached by nuts and bolts, comes in a carrying case. They're very large, oversized rulers, making it very, very convenient for an investigator to take out to a crime scene and readily put up for measurement purposes. Years ago, something like this didn't even exist. With the emergence of TV shows, way back to like CSI Las Vegas, the very first one, it just became like a new fad, a whole new industry for inventors to create things like this, materials like this, equipment like this to assist forensic investigators at crime scenes, and this is an example of that. So here's the grid method. You try to be consistent in what size each one of your boxes within the grid are. In this case, it's a 2x2. You try to be consistent in your labeling. If I was labeling this, I would do the top row across. I would start with A and go A1, A2, A3, A4. Below it, B1, B2, B3, B4. So I can see the correlation between my A3, B3, C3, and know that they basically fall within the same column, different rows of your grid pattern. And again, that would be created using strings. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you have the perimeter ruler method. And again, this is a kit, oversized rulers that are attached by, but basically nuts and bolts, or bolts and knobs can be readily put together and help you measure your bloodstain pattern and give you a correlation of where everything is located. So it's basically, in this depiction, it's one one large grid, or you can create it, 2 or 3 or 4 grids by adding other rulers. That orange column you see over on the left-hand side is actually the carrying case. I'm going to move I got my photo in the way here. So, okay, now I can see this better. So some things I wanted to point out here that really aren't as relevant with bloodstain pattern analysis, but goes right to the heart of other talks we've had, and that would be cross-contamination. So, using this method, remember what I said with the strings, you're pretty much one and done. You would never, ever want to use the strings over again. Likewise with this, so you've got these hard plastic rulers that you can put together and take apart. They would need to be decontaminated before they are placed back in this orange sleeve. Likewise, you have those evidence tents at the bottom. Those, in this case, are plastic evidence tents. They also make paper ones. Paper is what I preferred, because I would use them once and then dispose of them or log them into evidence with my other evidence if I felt it was necessary. So in this case, the rulers would have to be decontaminated before being placed back in the container. Those 3 tents, 1, 2, and probably 3, you can see just the tip of number 3 in the foreground, as well as that crime scene kit that you can see part of in the lower left-hand corner. At the very least, the bottom of that would have to be wiped down, decontaminated before any of this was placed back into the crime scene truck or whatever vehicle was used to transport all of this equipment out to the crime scene.
I mean, I would say that we're not necessarily used to always seeing those perimeter rulers, but Tim brings up a good point about we certainly do see the evidence tents. They get brought out often, and whether they're being decontaminated after their use in a crime scene is something important to bring up with your detectives on the cases.
And these same tents are being used in a whole wide variety of cases. They can be used at a crime scene. They can be used at a search scene. They can be used in a white collar case where you have a warrant to search a place, and they're being placed next to documents or the laptop or a hard drive. So they go from search scene to search scene. So
Tim, what's
cross-contamination.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Tim, just what's the best way to decontaminate these items?
There's actually bottles like Clorox wipe type bottles that you can use to decontaminate. Larger items are typically decontaminated with a mixture of Clorox and water that will mix up and decontaminate surfaces, and then we typically will let them air dry, because if you wipe them off with a rag or paper towels, now you're introducing something else to them. So it's nice to just to wash them with a decontaminant liquid and water, and then let them air dry, all under a controlled situation. I would typically put down these rolls. We have rolls of this brown paper that sort of look like grocery bags, and do it on them, let them drip dry, and then load them back into the vehicles or put them back into their larger containers.
I got a follow-up question from Tim McDonald about the fact that would the cleaning substance ruin the crime scene at all?
So the cleaning substance is not used in the crime scene. It's used away from the crime scene. So you would move it. You wouldn't do it in this room. You would do it away from this room, and you would do it before you loaded it back into your vehicle. And this way, you wouldn't want to put it in the vehicle and take it back to your office and then do it, because then you've cross-contaminated the vehicle. So you'd want to do it first.
Great.
All right, let me see if I can move this back down. Okay, so factors that can help reconstruct the scene. Surface texture. Um, surface texture play an important role on what your spatter looks like. So on a harder, non-porous surface, such as glass or a smooth tile or very smooth linoleum, you will have a surface that looks like that top photo. And on a rough surface, like a concrete floor or wood, or I mean, I guess carpet could be considered a rougher surface. The results in irregularly shaped stains with serrated edges and possibly satellite spatter. If you remember in one of those first few slides, we were talking about satellite spatter. So you have the parent spatter or the parent blood stain, and then you'll have satellites. So if you look in that lower photograph there, you'll have the main spatter or the main stain, and then you'll have those little ones off to the side. That's more likely to happen in a rough surface or a surface that is slightly porous or has serrated edges than in a smooth one. And that may be anti-intuitive to what a lot of you think would happen, but try to equate it with water, which in your lifetime, I'm sure all of you has spilled water from varying heights. Maybe you were carrying a glass or a pitcher of water, and it spilled on the floor. It's affected by the amount of water, the height of the spill, and the surface it lands on. But if you think about it, and it lands on a smooth surface, it typically will end up in one big spill with a fairly smooth border, and maybe smaller ones around it, but it'll sort of, for lack of a better term, bead up, as opposed to if you're dropping something on a concrete floor that's fairly porous and maybe irregular shaped. You've got some absorption going on. You have a varying surface that it's hitting, and it causes this irregular shape, and it causes satellite spatter.
And we hope in the next few months, when we can get people back in here, that we'll actually be able to bring people in, and Tim will demonstrate something like this, as well as some of the other practices that we've talked about, and it'll let you even experiment with it on future CLEs and more hands-on time with this stuff.
Yeah, we are really looking forward to the time when you can come into the office and we can do hands-on demonstrations and actually let you see some of the equipment and techniques that we've talked about via Zoom, where you can see that and do that in person. So finding the origin of an impact helps determine where the blood was projected from, and it shows the position of the victim and or the subject when the event took place. It can also help determine how many times an object came into contact with the source of blood.
And Tim, before we move on into the next slide, there's just a follow-up question on what we were talking about with the evidence markers, those evidence tents. What would the best way to store those evidence tents to prevent contamination?
So they actually come with they actually come in a bag themselves. It's typically it's a yellow canvas bag that they are all stacked one on top of each other, and they fit nicely into this bag. You can buy it with or without the bag. Again, the important part is if you're going to use that type, to make sure you properly clean them or decontaminate them afterwards. I used paper ones for this very reason. They usually come in both letters and numbers. Typically, when I would do a crime scene or a search scene. Rooms, different rooms were designated by letters, room A, B, C, D, E, F, G. This way, one person wasn't calling it a kitchen, and another one calling it, a dining room, so that you call it room B. And that evidence was referred to by numbers. So you'll see these yellow tents with both letters and numbers. You'll actually even see some with the scale built into them, which is really nice and really convenient, so that you don't have to keep laying scale down next to an object when you're photographing it, up close with scale. But likewise, you can get paper ones, and you get them flat, but they can actually be folded over in half, and you can create a tent out of them. And then that totally gets rid of that whole cross-contamination issue, because when you're finished with them, they can either, number one, be thrown out, or if there's some reason you feel that they should be saved, they can easily be folded up, put all together, put in one big envelope, marked appropriately, and put in with the rest of the evidence that's collected.
Great.
So we're back to this illustration again, and again it's a great one, and this goes right to what we were talking about here. Also determine how many times an object came in contact with the source of blood. So there's a lot of different things that happens when a hammer or a pipe or a bat or a baton comes in contact with a blood source. You'll have forward spatter, you'll have back spatter, which are both created by the force of the impact, whereas you'll have like what's referred to as blowback, which will be found inside the barrel of a gun, which is created not so much by the force of the energy, but by the vacuum that's created when a bullet passes through the barrel of a gun, and that's where your blowback comes from, not to be confused with back spatter. And then you have cast off, and cast off can help you analyze the crime scene, because it can be indicative of the number of blows that were struck. So you could see 3 different cast-off patterns like the one you see at the top here. You could have 3 different and distinct ones. So that would mean how many blows were struck. Well, it's always the number of cast-off, or at least the number of cast-off stains that you see plus 1. Okay, the first blow does not create cast-off. The first blow is what then what cracks the person's head open or creates a cut, of which then blood starts to pool, and then it's that second strike that collects the blood, and then the swinging back of it or to the side of it is what creates the cast off. So the number of possible blows are always at least 3 plus 1. If it was 4 blows, okay, the 3 cast offs plus the initial blow. Factors that help you reconstruct the scene. Shape and directionality, we've talked a little bit about that. The shape of the mark or the stain, where it lands, reveals the direction in which the drop was traveling and the amount of force it was projected with. So we're gonna get into the different type of impacts. There's varying degrees of impact, and the stains or the droplets can show you the direction of travel. And say it was someone that was actually their arm was cut and they're dripping blood. That'll also help you determine whether it was traveling involved or no traveling involved. If they were stationary, much like that example I gave you where you spilled water on the floor, And if it's a smooth surface, it'll be a more of a round stain. And if it's a porous, irregularly shaped surface, it'll be irregularly shaped with some possible satellite stains. Blood's the same way. So if it's a stationary drop, they're going to be more rounder in shape, and they're going to stack on top of each other or very close to each other. If there's motion, if there's travel, you'll get more of an elongated stain, with the tail of the stain always pointing towards the direction of travel. And this is easier to show if we were all in person, and it's definitely much easier to go over and learn. And if we have like a 4 or 5 day course like I was talking about, and you can actually measure the length of the elongated stain and tell all kinds of additional things about it. But just so you know, if it's pretty much a stationary drop of blood, it's more towards the round area, and if they're elongated, it shows that there was travel, and the tail of the stain, it points towards the direction of travel.
Tim, there's a question with respect to the cast off stains. Would they ever be able to demonstrate the size of a weapon, or do you think that the presence of cast off stains just helps demonstrate the number of blows?
I don't know if you could give an exact size of a weapon, but the amount of cast off would be indicative of the size of the weapon. The greater the surface area is on the weapon, the more blood it can collect when the blow is struck, and the more it can collect. And that will also have to do with not only surface area, like how big the surface area is, but what type of surface area it was. If it's smooth, it may not collect as much blood as if it has some type of irregular shape and is maybe semi-porous. And it's all about how much blood can be gathered when the blow is struck, and then consequently when it comes back, whatever the weapon was or the item was, how much it can cast off. And how much is cast off also has to do with how quickly, how much speed is involved in the swinging. The faster the speed, the more cast off you're going to have. So it's not an exact science. One of those first words that I highlighted and underlined in a different color and made orange was, there's a lot of interpretation that goes on. There's some things that are exact. There's other things that are interpretive. But very good question. So now we're going to get into classifying the type of blood spatter patterns. This can help the investigators determine what type of weapon was used, if the victim was moved, where the suspect went after the crime, if objects were moved during the crime. We'll have a really nice photo of that in the very end of our presentation today. What happens if objects are moved after the commission or during the commission of a crime.
And I think that this is, when you're able to identify something as impact spatter versus a transfer stain, it can really help to, corroborate a statement or refute a statement, whether it's by your client, by another witness. And I think of the example of when somebody talks about that they found a victim and they went and they checked on the victim, and that's the reason why their clothing is bloody, trying to explain away it as a transfer stain. But really, when the clothes are observed, it shows an impact spatter that would have only really gotten there because of they are that it's consistent with a beating as opposed to the easy transfer of actually checking on somebody. So if these stains are able to be identified, it can help or hurt in in refuting the statements that have been given.
Right. One of the whole ideas behind doing this and you having a general understanding of all of this goes towards, interviewing or questioning after the fact. If you have a general understanding of this and you've looked at the photographs first, analyzed them, as a novice, but still having some general understanding of it, and then going out and interviewing someone or questioning someone. I always say the best question to ask is the one that you already have the answer to, because it tells you so many things and it helps you read the person that you're speaking to, as far as frankness, honesty, things of that nature. So yeah, it's great to have a general understanding in your mind of what happened already, and then going and doing an interview, as opposed to going in blind, having not looked at any of the photograph, relying on what they say, and then going back and looking at the photographs. So I think it's a good thing, at the very least, to have this general understanding. And if there's things you don't understand, then go and speak to the expert. So the smaller the drops, the faster the movement of the blood. Okay, that makes, I think, a lot of sense. That would be the case. So classifying blood types stains, the most common type of blood stain pattern found at a crime scene is impact spatter. Okay, and there's different types of impact, and we'll talk about those. And that's basically when an object comes into contact with a source of blood. Forward spatter, again, in this diagram that we keep showing again, is basically when an object comes in contact with a source of blood, it's that spatter that is projected forward. Back spatter is just that. It's that spatter that goes projected backwards. The interesting thing about that is, of course, that is potentially then deposited on an object or the person creating the impact. So we talk about velocity. We're talking about, and that's basically the speed in which something travels with direction. Our first type of impact spatter we'll talk about is low velocity. Okay, so this is something moving at a very low speed. Examples of that, we talked about that. A person who has a cut arm and blood is coming out and it's basically falling to the ground by gravity alone. Okay, in low speed impact, it's usually there's minimal force involved, and the object is dropping into and splashing blood from a blood pool. So there's not a lot of speed involved with this type of spatter. It's classified by individuals that work in this field as the velocity being up to 5 feet per second or 1.5 meters per second. To give you another way of looking at it, if something is traveling around 5 feet per second, it's traveling at around like 3.4 miles per hour. So, and 3.4 miles an hour, that's about what the average person, or maybe a little faster than how fast the average person walks. So just to kind of put it in relation to different speeds that we'll be talking about. In these cases, you're going to have large separate or compounded drops with a diameter of larger than 4 millimeters. So this is a good representation of the size of the drops that you would have to be considered a low velocity impact spatter. Now we move on to medium velocity. And just like it says, it's caused by a medium speed as opposed to the low speed. Examples of a medium velocity impact spatter would be blunt force trauma, a beating, a stabbing. Now we've gone from that velocity of around 5 feet per second up to about 25 feet per second, or about 5 times as fast. So now we're talking about if you were to put it in miles per hour, we've gone from 3.4 miles per hour, like how fast a person walks, up to around 17 miles per hour, which Alicia tells me is about how fast she jogs on a given day.
I run like the wind. It's amazing.
Now because we have a faster speed, we have smaller size. Our diameter of our stains now has gone down to from 4 millimeters to 1 to 3 millimeters. So this photo is representative of what your impact spatter might look with a medium speed, a medium velocity impact spatter. And then we have high velocity. And I'm sure you all know or can guess what this would be in relation to. Caused by a high speed impact or force to a blood source. And examples of this, the most common one, most obvious one, of course, would be a gunshot. But I've also seen many in my day caused by explosive devices. Working a post-blast situation, like the type I worked all over the world, where it's just those explosions are traveling at a very, very, very high speed, and it causes a high-speed impact spatter stain. And then you also have we talked about expirated blood before that can occur during a cough or a sneeze. And if it's a very robust cough, it could cause air leaving your body at a very high rate of speed and causing a high velocity impact spatter. Sneezes are typically at a high rate of speed and would definitely cause a high velocity impact spatter.
And those aren't just taking into consideration, that's not taking into consideration like just internal injuries that is causing bleeding. That can be bleeding that's coming down somebody's face, and it results in them in coughing or sneezing as it's on their, like, pooling on their face, and it resulting from that way. It's not necessarily indicative of an internal injury.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, it could be running down their face, and they could be coughing or sneezing or blowing out of their mouth very aggressively to keep the blood from going in their mouth, and it can cause patterns of that nature. So we're talking about a very high rate of speed here. We're up into the 4 times the medium velocity. Now we're up to 100 feet per second. Upwards of, if you wanted to equate it to miles per hour, now you're up around 68 miles per hour. So something that's traveling very, very quickly. And and it varies even within gunshots. You'll have a shotgun slug that'll travel at one speed, and shot will travel at another. A handgun can have varying degrees of velocity, subsonic up into much faster rounds that'll travel through a gun and strike a target.
Now, Tim, there's a question about somebody taking a blood thinner, if that would have an effect on the analysis of spatter.
It absolutely does, and I was going to mention that in one of the next upcoming slides, but now's as good a time as any to talk about it. So yeah, there are those outside forces which I talked about in the very beginning. A blood thinner, which indeed does thin your blood, and it would also weigh in on the post blood stain pattern, and into now you're getting into what time did this occur and how much clotting has occurred, because clotting starts to happen within so many minutes after blood appears at a scene, and it would have an effect on that. Other things that have an effect on it are altitude, humidity, temperature. All of those have an effect, and but now you're really drilling down into really specific things. A lot of that you would have to try to go back and see how warm it was that day, how humid it was that day. You'd have to go and check, medical records, or have someone tell you I'm on blood thinners, or I was on blood thinners at that time, or look at medical records of a deceased to see if they were. So the more you know about the crime scene, the more you know about the individual. I think the more exact you can probably be with your analysis. So, and this is fairly apparent. Using droplet size as a useful tool that can give insight into the general nature of a crime, but it cannot give you specifics. Bloodstain pattern analysis should include observations of the stain, the size, the shape, the location, distribution, to accurately reconstruct what has happened. So in this last slide here, what I thought I would do is bring the three different velocities together so you can have them side by side. So they are very distinct when you look at them like this, with your low velocity on the left, your medium velocity in the middle, and of course your high velocity on the right hand side. When you put them in comparison like this on the same screen, it does become very obvious. And the more you work in this area, the faster you'll be able to recognize certain things, including whether it was low, medium, or high velocity impact.
And here's our second code, is the word scene for anybody who doesn't see it on the screen. SCENE, scene.
I think that, I said we were going to talk about this, and
Yeah.
we've put this in here. Alicia, I think you'd like to speak to this.
Yeah, this is just in one of the books in our forensic library that Tim and I have been building the past year, Techniques of Crime Scene Investigation. There's a lot of talk about cases, and a lot of practical knowledge that's given in this book. And there were these photographs that we just thought were really great demonstrations. It's from the Oregon State Forensic Lab. It was an assault of an elderly female and blunt force trauma. They had suspected it was the blunt force trauma had been conducted with an oxygen tank, and they took these photographs, the one on the left being the first photograph. Their attention was drawn to that one tank that has the towel in front of it. It looked, when they looked up close, as though there was some hair on there. And they noticed the pooling of the blood, which you see in that second photo there. Once they removed that cylinder, they saw that little round circle of blood, the blood stain on the floor. And then they also were able to observe the impact spatter behind all of the cylinders, and particularly where that cylinder, which had been removed, now they see that there is an impact spatter on the wall where that cylinder would have been. And if you go to the next photo, that becomes really relevant. Tim, if you could go to the next slide. When they take the third photograph, which is when they removed all of the cylinders, and you see the void where all those other cylinders were, but the impact spatter going down where that one particular cylinder was and, to help support the fact that they believed that this assault had been, that cylinder had been used to assault this woman. So I just thought those were really great. It was a great case example, great photographs to demonstrate a lot of the terms that Tim was talking about today. Go ahead, Tim.
There's a lot going on with these three photos. You can see, your patterns. You can see wipes. You can see possible swipes. In this one, if you look like really close, if maybe you have a big enough screen, you can see what we refer to as skeletonized blood spatter, another term that's used, and it's something that all of you have seen before and experienced. If you've been bleeding and you bled on a shirt, or you bled through like a shirt, or got a drop of blood on your shirt, that as it dries, it gets lighter. It keeps its shape, but it gets lighter around the edges, depicting what the original stain size was. But the stain migrates towards its center, so it's darker in the center, and it's more of a shadow around the edge. That's referred to as skeletonized blood stains. And you can see some of that here. So great example of voids. Great example to show how something wasn't in its place during the assault, but then was placed there because of the lack of a void. There should be a void and there isn't one, and because that one canister wasn't there, it was actually used in the attack. So great series of photos.
All right, and then that's pretty much it. It concludes our presentation. I did have one other question that came in, Tim, about high velocity spatter being indicative. Would that be indicative of a shotgun blast? You think that's fair to
Yeah,
say?
whether it was a slug or whether it was shot, absolutely, that is high velocity. Sure, it's not traveling, the same as a 9mm round would travel, out of a rifled, handgun barrel, but still traveling, way up there in that high velocity range, and it's because merely just the size of the bullet alone, it's gonna create a huge bloodstain pattern.
And that was the last of the questions that I received. So we'll give it another 30 seconds. But barring getting any other questions, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Tim, for your time and expertise and knowledge. So
You're welcome.
And I'll just use these last 20 seconds while we wait, if anybody comes in, to remind you that Tim is here as a resource to look at crime scene photos. So I would urge you that if you have something, have good crime scene photos, to reach out to myself, to Dan, to your investigator who's already assigned, so that we can link you up with Tim and get your discovery to him to take a look at. So, all right, I have no other questions. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Tim.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everyone.